I need some traction. You need some traction.
That was not my choice. I don't know how that picture happened there. I'm also not sure if my introduction has now alienated you with the intelligence background or set the expectations too high with quadrupling revenue. So we're gonna try. We're gonna try a couple of these things, but my purpose today isn't to teach you any tactics. I'm not gonna be walking through any tactics, not gonna be walking you through any frameworks. Frankly, my goal today is to scare the shit out of you. And I know that's a little aggressive, it's a lot aggressive, but the big thing that we're gonna talk about today, based on a lot of data that we've seen, is the very nature that acquisition is diminishing and will diminish as the main fulcrum of growth. And I know that's kind of an aggressive statement, especially given the avatar that was just shown to you, so you might not be taking me seriously. So to basically give you a little bit of background and to kind of kick things off, I want to give some background on who the hell am I to make a statement like that. So it's not necessarily me, it's just the data that we have access to with the company that I'm a part of. So founded Price Intelligently about 4 years ago, and at Price Intelligently we have two different suites of software. The first suite of software focuses on price optimization. So we help SaaS companies essentially make more money through their pricing. And then the second piece of software that we have is something called ProfitWell. And it's basically free subscription financial metrics. So you plug in Stripe, you plug in Zora, you plug in whatever you're using, and you get instant access to your MRR, your cohorts, your churn, all of that kind of fun stuff. And I'm not telling you this to kind of pitch you what we're actually doing. There's plenty of time for that later. What I'm telling you here is basically we've seen inside more subscription businesses than anyone else out there. And we've been called on this once. We did beat the person who called us out on it. Currently, we've seen inside about 2,800 companies in the subscription SaaS space. And that's given us this huge bevy of data that we're sitting on that'll hopefully bring some really, really good insights to support this thesis of acquisition diminishing as the main fulcrum of growth. So to kick things off, I want to take a huge step back and just give you a little context as to why we're talking about acquisition in the first place. And more frankly, talk about why we've become so obsessed, stalker level obsessed with acquisition. Acquisition in good amounts is obviously really, really good for your business, but right now we've kind of taken it a little too far as an ecosystem. And the first data we're gonna look at is we looked at about 25,000 blog posts, and we did a little bit of an anthropological study. And the reason that we looked at blog posts is because we write about the things that we know, and we also write about things that get us traffic, right? It's a little bit of a chicken or the egg. If we write a blog post about Facebook ads and it gets a lot of shares, we're gonna write more content about Facebook ads. Now what we found in looking at these 25,000 blog posts, and they were all focused specifically on growth. So it wasn't posts about team culture, it wasn't posts about transparency, it was all about actually making you an impact on your bottom line. What we found is that about 8 out of 10 blog posts out of those 25,000 were all about acquisition. Little bit less than 1 out of 10 of those blog posts were all about retention. And then lo and behold, monetization basically was only a couple of blog posts. And sadly, or maybe not so sadly, a lot of those were written by us at Price Intelligently. Now what's interesting about this is we wanted to take this data a step further. So we looked at the company landscape. Basically looked at what are we building in SaaS specifically. So we looked at about 8,000 different B2B SaaS companies and specifically B2B companies that were focused on growth, mainly because again, if we buy certain products from other folks, it shows us where our priorities are. And very, very similarly, we found that out of these 8,000, about 9 out of 10 of those software companies were focused on acquisition, getting you more customers, getting you a better conversion rate. Less than 1 out of 10 of those companies were focused on retention. And then there's a dozen of us focused on monetization. It's the saddest SaaS group out there. So what's interesting is this might be kind of a little bit of its own chicken or the egg problem, right? These two data sets together. There's a lot of acquisition-focused companies. Therefore, there's a lot of acquisition-focused content. So what we did is we went to the source. Or actuality, side note, actually, I tried to make a logo slide. I wanted to show you all the acquisition companies, all the retention ones. But these are the acquisition companies. And so it looks a little bit messy. So what we did, though, to back up here, is we went and talked to SaaS founders and executives. And we asked them, if you were to put focus in your business on getting new logos, keeping those logos longer, or making more money off of the logos you already have, what we found is the focus was all about more logos. We want more customers. This is about 1,400 different companies out there. We don't really care as much about keeping those customers around longer. We don't necessarily care about making more money per customer. And when we look at this data even further and we asked, you have 100 units of time, where are you going to distribute those units of time across these 3 different fulcrums or pillars in your business? And most folks were like, give me more acquisition. Let's spend more money on marketing. Let's spend more time on marketing, not necessarily focusing on things like retention or monetization. So what this data is supporting, at least in my opinion, is that we think acquisition is our oxygen. But as we're going to talk about a little bit, and as the next data set is going to show us, in actuality, acquisition has become more like crack to us. And as your parents told you when you were growing up, don't do drugs. And for some of the cooler parents that were out there, they said, if you're going to do drugs, for the love of God, don't do crack. Because it's bad for you, and it's also bad for your business. So we looked at, okay, let's look at why acquisition is diminishing. Let's actually support that thesis a little bit. So the first data that we looked at was, our world is becoming more competitive. So 10 years ago, you could start a CRM company, you could start something like Crazy Egg, you could start Dropbox, you could start some of these companies that are very, very specific feature-oriented, and you wouldn't have a lot of competitors, right? It was a little bit harder to create software, it was a little bit harder to create a company, and ultimately, it was one of those things where we had kind of these open markets. But over time, what's happened is we talked to about 300 companies, I believe, who have been around for about 5 years or longer, and we found that the competitive landscape for a lot of different companies is getting much, much more competitive. And what's happening is we used to have maybe like 1 or 2 competitors, and now we're looking at dozens of competitors for different pieces of software. So take Profitwell, for instance. I'm sure you guys have all heard of things like Barometrics, ChartMogul, Insight Squared, Domo even, if you want to really expand the competitive landscape. There's a lot of different products out there for something like analytics. But what's really interesting about this data is that when you cross-reference it with the fact that the relative value of features is trending downward, creating what we like to call race to the bottom type pricing. So what we did, and I'm going to explain this data a little bit differently because it's a little bit of a different visualization to look at, is our pricing software, because we've been around for about 4 years now, we have a really, really good bevy of data across those different years. And so what we did is we looked at core features and then some of those differentiable features that a lot of us kind of use as our moats compared to some of our competitors. Things like integrations, things like analytics, single sign-on is a pretty famous one from about 5-10 years ago. And what we found is that 4 years ago, these products were worth X, 100%, right? We're all relative against 4 years ago. But over time, even the core feature valuation on those particular products has gone down. And this makes sense, right? If you look at a company like Yesware, email tracking, Yesware was one of the only people in town doing email tracking for salespeople. But now you have things like Mixmax, you have Sidekick, which is free from HubSpot, you have probably a dozen other products that I don't even know about, all focused on email tracking. So that particular product is no longer novel, and unless you're working on something like space exploration or something that has a huge giant moat around the product, all of a sudden, the value of your individual features is no longer as high as it used to be. You can also see this in the enterprise happening. It's much, much easier to produce different features and produce those features much quicker, that all of a sudden you used to have situations when you're comparing Marketo or HubSpot, and enterprise companies would say, well, we were using HubSpot, but Marketo has more enterprise features. But now that moat is slowly drying up, and those companies are getting closer and closer together. But if we take a huge step back even further, and we just look at the data surrounding acquisition, monetization, and retention, and we try to normalize it even further. So we built a model, and what we basically were trying to answer here is, if we improve each of those main pillars in your business by the same relative amount, what would be the impact on your bottom line? So if we improved your acquisition by 1%, meaning we increased your lead flow by 1%, or we increase your conversion rate by 1%, the relative impact across 500 different companies in the SaaS space would be about 3% boost in your bottom line. Now, if we were to improve your retention by 1%, so this is essentially your gross churn rate or your overall net revenue retention by that same amount, the same relative amount by 1%, the impact on your bottom line is going to be just under 7%. And finally, if we improve our monetization by 1%, meaning we increase our price by 1%, we increase our overall ARPU by 1% through a number of different means, we're going to see just under a 13% boost in our bottom line. So the numbers here aren't necessarily important. It's the relative relationship between these different numbers that's extremely important. Because focusing on your retention and your monetization has 2 to 4x the impact of focusing on acquisition. And this is real data that was collected essentially in the past year, basically normalized to give you that insight into what's happening through the different pillars of your businesses. But what's fascinating about this is to kind of go back to the previous data sets. This is what we care about. This is what matters. This is what we care about. And this is what matters. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. There's a lot of pressure from investors. There's a lot of pressure to grow. But because we're seeing these relative value and features diminish, and because we're seeing things become more and more competitive, you essentially need to rely on the main pillars of your product to make sure that you're keeping those users longer and that you're focusing in on actually making more money per individual user than you had to maybe 5, even 10 years ago. And what's interesting about this and what's kind of sad about this is that we're really, really ill-equipped to make this transition. So what we did is we went back and we started talking to these companies, similar to kind of the marketing data that we went after in terms of founders and executives at different companies. And we started to look at the fact that we really, really don't know our buyers. And when I talk about knowing your buyers, I'm not talking about kind of like cute avatars with pretty names like Marketing Mary or Enterprise Eddie or things like that. I'm talking about those cute names plus a lot of quantified data against what those buyers actually care about, what their willingness to pay looks like, what your unit economics look like, what your usage metrics look like. And what we found of those 1,400 founders that we talked to is that most people don't have anywhere near this level of data within their organization. Or if they do, it's not siloed somewhere that everyone has access to it. And most of us have just kind of thought about our buyers. And that's okay. You know something about your customer, or else you wouldn't be going after the market that you're going after. But it's really, really important to make sure this is all down in a central place so that everyone can use it. And so typically when I show people this type of data, I get a lot of reactions on like, well, we don't necessarily have this all in one place, but we talk to a lot of customers. And what we found is a lot of people don't talk to a lot of customers. So most of us aren't talking to more than 10 people in a customer development capacity per month. And what's even interesting about this is then people are like, well, we do surveys or we do intercom messages, we do this scalable kind of outreach to get the data that we need for customer development. Well, we're not really doing that either. And then my other favorite excuse to this is like, we do a lot of testing. We do a lot of multivariate A/B testing. Nope. This includes marketing tests. So think about that a second. We all love to retweet articles about customer development. We all love to retweet articles about experimentation and A/B testing. Not a lot of us are doing it. And what's interesting about this is that this really should be scary. I don't know if it's scaring the shit out of you, but like this should be scary mainly because in your business, when you look at your pricing page, whatever it looks like on your business, it might be a rate card, it might be an enterprise deal, it could be a number of different manifestations. But everything that you're doing in your business, from your marketing and your sales, to your product team, to your finance, to your operations, is used to either drive someone to this decision point or to justify the price that you're putting on these pages. It's the very exchange rate on the value that you are producing. And if you don't know who those customers are that you're driving to this particular conversion point, there's no way in hell you're going to be able to justify those particular prices. And what's interesting about this is that fixing this is not rocket science. This isn't something that like, all of a sudden, we've just discovered customer development. Customer development has been around for decades. It's one of these things where we've just gotten lazy because it's been easy, right? CPCs used to be pretty cheap. Now they're getting more competitive. Relative CAC is getting more competitive. And now we're in this transition point where we've kind of forgotten how to do our customer development. Now we need to go back to it, mainly because that's what's going to win in the future. So I don't have a ton of tactics right now to show you. I'm going to share a bunch of resources if you download the slides. We've open sourced a lot of the algorithms we've used. We've open sourced our process. So there's a lot of this stuff that we can help you with, but it really comes down to three main things. The first is quantifying those buyer personas. The second is making sure that you have a customer development process. And then finally, making sure that you go beyond feature-based differentiation. So quantifying your customer personas, basically it means doing something like this in a spreadsheet, making sure that you collect all of this data, and I'll share some methodologies that you can use in the resources at the end here. But you have to go to your customer. And for the love of God, if you take anything away from this conversation, it is talk to your freaking customer. Freaking added for emphasis. You also need to implement a customer development process. This isn't a one-time activity. Put a number on the board, make sure you're talking to X number of customers per month in a customer development capacity. Here's a framework you can use for those of you who don't have one. Basically making sure there's a committee, you meet at the beginning of a quarter, you figure out what your problems you're going to focus on, you go collect data from those particular problems, you make a decision, you move on, and you keep going. You can do this every single quarter, whether you're a huge company or whether you're a small company. And big companies in the room who might be sitting back and saying, oh, well, we're okay, like we do this stuff. All of that data was across companies big, small, and medium. We oftentimes find that big companies have a bigger problem with this because their DNA has been so acquisition focused, and now they have 2,000, 5,000 employees that they have to kind of rejigger their entire thinking around monetization and retention. And the final piece here, and this has been talked about a lot, Des talked about it, a couple of the other talks kind of marched on it, but the idea here is you gotta move beyond feature-based differentiation. And there's a few ways you can do that. User experience is one of them. If you create that brand equity, if you create that experience equity, people are gonna stick with you longer. Those basically switching costs will increase. The other way is this just do it for me philosophy. So software 10 years ago, if you think about Salesforce 10 years ago, it was like software that was like, I need to show my boss I'm doing work. I need to show them there are toggles, there are filters, there's all this crazy shit that I'm doing work, boss. Now it's all about, I need to show my boss results. And because of that, you have an opportunity to create software that doesn't have a lot of toggles, doesn't have a lot of like widgets and things like that, but actually just does it for you. Think about SumoMe, that suite of software, versus a Bounce Exchange. Software is the same. It's almost the exact same piece of software, very, very different delivery mechanism. And the final piece here is value metric-based pricing. We've written a ton about this, but basically it means focus your pricing specifically on some sort of metric of value. Don't charge, just for features. Charge per user, charge per video, charge per X, Y, or Z. There's a lot of different ways you can figure out what that unit of value is, but that's where most pricing is going, at least for companies that are doing really, really well. And so to kind of close out here, you will be left behind. I know that's scary. I know that's like, hey, your inclination is like, who the hell is this guy? And that's fine. All data supports acquisition diminishing as the main fulcrum of growth, and retention and monetization being the next big waves of making sure that your businesses continue to grow aggressively. So here's my contact info. This is where you can get the slides. Appreciate the time, and I'll be around to answer any questions. Thanks, guys.
I need some traction. You need some traction.